The Lord of the Rings was a monumental moment in cinematic history, both critically and commercially. However, with time passing, audiences began to notice a few problems with the series. So, how did this happen? The director of all three films, Peter Jackson, originally dreamt of making these movies when he first read the books as a boy. When he finally got his chance in the late 90s, he had quite the pitch for New Line Cinema. He proposed that they shoot all three films back to back. Doing it this way would cut down on some of the film's costs, as well as shortening the time between each of the films' release in the trilogy. This would also turn out to be a bit of an exaggeration on Peter Jackson's part, as they would have to return after each film to do reshoots. This was quite the gamble for New Line Cinema, as the fantasy genre was not the cash cow that it was now. As well as, once you start production on a 3-film block, you're kind of locked in. So if the first film didn't work, they were kind of screwed. Despite all of that, New Line actually agreed to this and greenlit the trilogy for around $93 million per film. And Peter Jackson and his team got to work. The making of The Lord of the Rings is one of the most well-known stories in cinema. This is largely due to the extensive behind-the-scenes documentaries that accompanied each film throughout the production. Because of these documentaries, we get an inside look at nearly every aspect that makes this franchise so good, from the makeup artist to the director himself. They show the highs and the lows of adapting such an enormous property to the silver screen. One of the first things that we see in this documentary is the insane amount of pre-production time that these films had. Jackson and his team had years to plan out every aspect of the film, from scouting locations to planning the forced perspective shots to make the hobbits look small, all the way down to nailing down the screenplay. This work is something that we rarely see in any big budget film these days, and it kind of shows. After all the pre-production work was done, the team began on the 438-day shooting schedule. To put that into perspective, the normal amount of time to shoot a film is around 60 to 120 days. The Fellowship of the Ring, which debuted in 2001, had the unenviable task of introducing all of the different intricacies of Middle-earth to an audience that wasn't so fantasy-oriented. The opening narration sequence is a perfect display of meaningful and concise storytelling. It explains everything that we need to know, as well as the adventure that's about to unfold. We get to see the beauty and the simplicity that is the Shire, meeting all of our wacky characters, as well as seeing exactly what we want to save from being destroyed. With the amount of key characters that this film introduces, including Aragorn, Gimli, Legolas, Gandalf, all of the hobbits, with the sheer number of characters that this film introduces, this meant that the runtime was quite daunting, coming in at 2 hours and 58 minutes. Despite the runtime, the script is very focused. The goal is simple in concept: get the ring to Mount Doom before Sauron can get it. How exactly that will unfold is where the magic of this film really happens. The attention to detail and care for the world is something that this film establishes and will continue on for the rest of the series. At the end of the day, the gamble that New Line Cinema took paid off, with an astonishing $888 million in the worldwide box office, by far the biggest fantasy property of all time. Due to the back-to-back shooting schedule, The Twin Towers was released just 1 year later in 2002. The world fell in love with the characters of Middle-earth and couldn't wait to see more. Despite some American backlash for the title, it didn't stop them from flocking to the theaters. This sequel builds upon everything that the first film did so well, and even improves some aspects that were lacking in the first one. Twin Towers separates our fellowship, allowing multiple stories to be happening in parallel to each other, each of which is impactful in its own way. One of the aspects of the first film that left fans divided was the visual presentation. The film was shot in 60 frames per second, and that gave it a sort of unreal quality in some of the scenes. While Peter Jackson may have intended that, it wasn't really going well with audiences. The return to a more standardized visual style gives this film a more grounded feel, which is exactly what Peter Jackson was going for. And frankly, we can't talk about visual presentation without talking about the most revolutionary thing that this film does for cinema, and that is the character of Gollum. This fully computer-generated creation was a technical marvel, and something that had never been done to this scale before. The curators of this technology was Weta Digital, a leading provider of digital effects in Hollywood. Combine that with one of the most extraordinary battle sequences in the history of cinema, then you got quite the film on your hands. This also reflected in the box office, as the film pulled $932 million worldwide. This billion-dollar franchise was on the rise, and audiences only had to wait 1 more year for the epic conclusion. Return of the King was a cinematic event of a lifetime. In just 3 years, this franchise turned into a global phenomenon. This last film was the payoff to 3 years of build-up, and it delivered. Within this film, they take the time to build up the threat even more from what we've already seen. One of the highlights of this entire film is Frodo's continuous fight against the power of the ring. And the conclusion to that story, having Frodo and Sam be the heart of this franchise, is truly an emotional payoff that we all loved. Despite the world-ending stakes of armies clashing into each other, at the end of the day, the core of this franchise was two friends' love for each other. But since I mentioned the battles, they take yet another step up in this film. There is a true roller coaster of emotions that the audience goes through throughout the last battle sequence. There's highs, there's lows, there's everything in between. This all comes to a head when Aragorn takes command of his army, not knowing if Frodo had succeeded, and runs into battle. The killing of Sauron marked the end of a 3-year journey that the audience went through with these characters. Not only did this film make it a multi-billion-dollar property, it also cleaned up at the Oscars, winning a total of 11 different awards, including Best Picture. Both film lovers and casual audiences alike all agreed that this trilogy was one to remember. It is impossible to discuss these films without talking about the extended cuts. Despite the elongated time of the originals, there was still so much left on the cutting room floor. This added hours of additional content to the original trilogy, giving fans more of what they loved. They wanted to do these extended cuts as a way to build hype for the next film, as these would be released on DVD just a few months prior to the release of the next film. It is still debated to this day which cut is the best one to watch, with many die-hard fans dying on the hill of the extended cuts. We've sung the praises of this franchise for quite some time, and for good reason. However, in recent years, some audiences have begun to see a couple problems with the movies. And no, we don't mean the endless endings of Return of the King or the fact that they could have taken the Eagles the entire time. To begin with, there is a notable diversity issue that you can see throughout the franchise. This is odd when you consider that the idea of Sauron is to enslave all of mankind. So one would think that all of mankind would be represented in the fight against him. This also extends to the representation of women in the franchise. For the exception of all but one character, the entire fellowship as well as every single person in the army are all men. In a fantasy story like this, it presents the opportunity to represent all types of fan bases in the story. Whether or not that's realistic to the time period, well, there's Sauron. It's not real, so, who cares? This was an issue that was present throughout Tolkien's work. These books were published in the 1950s and are definitely a subject of their time. Despite that knowledge, it would have been nice to see a little more updates to the source material in terms of the adaptation. The Lord of the Rings might have a few problems, but it's certainly not deterred fans away. This billion-dollar franchise faced numerous obstacles along the way, but in the end, found a way to pull it together and make something truly special. This franchise is responsible for so much of what we love today. From Game of Thrones to The Witcher, nearly every fantasy medium is in some way inspired by this trilogy. There have been numerous attempts to replicate the success of this franchise, even one by Peter Jackson himself. However, despite all of those attempts, nobody has quite captured the magic that these original films were able to create. There is a heart and soul to these films that is not so easily replicated. Knowing that there is somebody out there who worked tirelessly to make sure that Treebird's scale is proper to the hobbits when he's holding him, or that the makeup on the orcs would stand up the test of time. It is because of that passion that these films will remain in one of the highest echelons of cinema. As we know, The Lord of the Rings continued beyond the original trilogy, with The Hobbit as well as Rings of Power. And even fans of those can admit that the original trilogy is where the good stuff is. What are your thoughts on The Lord of the Rings? Let us know in the comments down below. As always, thank you for watching ScreenRant. And be sure to come back next week for more discussions on your favorite TV shows and movies.